When an HOA tried to ban a disabled veteran's wheelchair ramp, they thought they had power. But the judge had other plans. You know how sometimes the smallest things end up being the biggest fights? Well, this story is about a man who discovered that his biggest battle wasn't overseas, but right in his own neighborhood. And it all started with something as simple as a wooden ramp. James was a retired veteran in his late 60s. He wasn't the kind of guy who liked to draw attention to himself. In fact, most people in the neighborhood didn't even know he had served multiple tours overseas until much later. After a serious injury during his final deployment, James relied on a wheelchair for most of his movement. He could stand for short periods, but stairs were nearly impossible for him to navigate. He and his wife, Linda, had purchased a modest home in a suburban neighborhood managed by, you guessed it, the dreaded Homeowners Association, the HOA. They had chosen the neighborhood because it was quiet, clean, and seemingly safe. James wanted peace after years of chaos, and Linda wanted a community where they could grow old together. At first, everything seemed fine. They moved in, decorated their home with a small garden in front, and kept everything tidy. James didn't really interact much with the HOA, and he assumed as long as he followed basic rules like mowing his lawn and not painting his house neon green, he'd be fine. But reality had other plans. As James's mobility worsened, Linda grew worried about him trying to climb the few steps leading into their home. Even with her help, it was dangerous. One evening, James nearly tipped backward while trying to get inside after a doctor's appointment. That was the moment Linda decided they needed to make a change. The very next weekend, James's son, Mark, came over to help build a simple wooden wheelchair ramp leading up to the front door. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, just sturdy and functional. It allowed James to roll in and out safely, without risking a fall. For James, it was more than just a ramp. It was freedom. It was independence. But to the HOA, it was an eyesore. Within 48 hours of the ramp being installed, James and Linda received a letter in the mail. The envelope had that official HOA logo on the top corner, the kind that always made homeowners groan. Linda read it aloud, her voice trembling with disbelief. Notice of violation. Your recent unauthorized modification to the exterior of your property is in direct violation of HOA Code 14B, which requires all exterior structures to be approved by the board. The ramp must be removed within 10 business days to avoid fines. Linda looked at James in shock. Unauthorized modification. It's a ramp. You need this. James clenched his jaw. He wasn't the type to lose his temper easily, but the words cut deep. He knew what this meant. A battle with the HOA. At first, James tried to be reasonable. He called the HOA office the next morning. The president, a man named Richard, answered the phone. Richard was the kind of guy who lived for HOA drama, power hungry, smug, and convinced the rules were more important than people. Look, Richard, James said, keeping his voice calm. This ramp isn't some kind of decoration. I need it to get in and out of my house safely. Richard didn't budge. I understand your concern, James, but rules are rules. The ramp alters the uniform appearance of the neighborhood. It wasn't approved, and it must come down. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. So you're telling me I should risk falling just so the houses all look the same? Richard chuckled slightly, the kind of condescending laugh that made your blood boil. We can't make exceptions. If we did it for you, we'd have to do it for everyone. That was when James realized this wasn't going to be easy. The following week, another letter arrived, this time a fine. $100 for the violation. Then another came the next week, $200. Richard and the HOA board were relentless. James and Linda felt trapped. Neighbors began to notice the tension. Some stopped by quietly to offer support. We think it's wrong what they're doing, whispered one neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, as she dropped off a casserole, but we don't want to get on the HOA's bad side. You know how they are. Others weren't so kind. One neighbor, a man named Greg, made a snide comment while walking his dog. If we let you keep your ramp, next thing you know, people will be building sheds and putting up fences. We bought into this neighborhood for a reason. Rules matter. James bit his tongue. This wasn't about sheds or fences. This was about his basic right to enter his own home safely. Late at night, as James sat by the window staring at the ramp, he thought about the irony. He had fought overseas for freedoms most people take for granted, yet here he was, fighting to simply have a ramp on his porch. It felt wrong. Linda sat beside him and placed her hand on his. We're not giving up. If they want to fight, they'll get one, but we're not taking that ramp down. James nodded. He felt the fire inside him spark again. The battle wasn't over, it was just beginning. And little did Richard and the HOA know. James wasn't the kind of man to lose. The fines didn't stop. Each week, another envelope arrived in James and Linda's mailbox, stamped with the HOA logo like a constant reminder of the battle raging in their own front yard. By the end of the first month, the fines had totaled nearly $1,000. James stared at the stack of letters on the kitchen table, his fists clenched. They're trying to bleed us dry, Linda. They think if they pile on enough fines, we'll cave. But caving wasn't in James's nature. He'd spent his life overcoming obstacles that would break most men. A few pieces of paper with dollar signs weren't going to stop him. Still, The financial pressure was real. Linda began to worry. What if they try to put a lien on the house? What if they drag us to court? James leaned back in his chair and let out a long sigh. Then we fight them in court. I've faced worse enemies than this HOA. But the HOA wasn't letting up. Richard, the president, was practically salivating over the chance to make an example of James. In the monthly HOA meeting, he stood at the front of the community clubhouse, speaking to the board and any homeowners who cared to attend. This isn't about one man's ramp, Richard declared. This is about protecting the integrity of our neighborhood. If we let him keep it, what's next? Satellite dishes on every roof. Chickens in the backyards. We can't have people doing whatever they want. A few board members nodded along, while others looked uneasy. But Richard's voice was the loudest in the room, and that was all that mattered. Word spread quickly. Some neighbors rallied behind James quietly, offering words of encouragement when Richard wasn't around. Others sided with the HOA, convinced that James's ramp was the beginning of a slippery slope. The neighborhood was divided. Then, one morning, James woke to find a bright orange notice taped to his front door. It was bold in your face and impossible to ignore. Final notice: remove the unauthorized structure within 7 days or face legal action. James ripped the paper down, his hands shaking with rage. Unauthorized structure, he muttered. It's a damn ramp. They're acting like I built a casino on my lawn. That night, Linda urged him to call their son Mark, who lived in another town. Maybe he can help us look into legal options, she suggested. Mark was furious when he heard the whole story. Dad, this is discrimination, plain and simple. They can't do this. The Americans with Disabilities Act exists for a reason. I'll help you fight them. The next day, Mark showed up with a folder full of printed articles, legal references, and phone numbers for disability rights organizations. Together they began drafting a response letter to the HOA citing federal law. It read in part, the removal of this wheelchair ramp would create a direct violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which requires reasonable accommodations for individuals with disabilities. Any attempt to force such removal will be met with legal action. James felt a surge of pride as he read the letter. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who might face this kind of treatment. The letter was hand-delivered to the HOA office the following morning. Richard didn't take it well. He called James personally, his voice dripping with disdain. So now you're threatening us with lawyers. That's how you want to play this. James didn't flinch. I'm not threatening you, Richard. I'm reminding you of the law. The ramp stays, Richard huffed. We'll see about that. And he hung up. The next week was tense. James noticed unfamiliar cars driving slowly past his house, people inside snapping photos of the ramp. He knew Richard had likely sent inspectors to document every angle, hoping to find something to use against him. Then came the HOA's next move. They filed a formal complaint with the county, alleging that the ramp violated building codes. James was stunned when he received notice of an inspection. When the inspector arrived, James wheeled himself outside to meet him. To his relief, the inspector wasn't hostile. He checked the ramp, measured its slope, and made a few notes. Finally, he looked at James and said quietly, "Honestly, this ramp is fine. Safer than a lot of the ones I see. I'll file the report, but you've got nothing to worry about here." James smiled for the first time in weeks. "Thank you. That means more than you know." But Richard wasn't done. At the next HOA meeting, he doubled down. This is not about disability. This is about order. We have rules, and rules are what keep this neighborhood beautiful. If he wants special treatment, he needs to move somewhere else. The room went silent. Even some of the board members shifted uncomfortably. One finally spoke up. "Richard, don't you think you're going too far? We're talking about a man's safety here." Richard glared. "If we let emotions dictate the rules, then we have no rules at all." Meanwhile, James and Linda began to gather support. Their son created a petition, going door to door to explain the situation. At first, many neighbors were hesitant to sign, afraid of Richard's retaliation. But once word spread about the ADA violation, the tide began to turn. One night, James sat at his dining table, staring at the growing stack of signatures. He felt hope again. The HOA wasn't invincible. But just when it seemed like things were shifting in James's favor, Richard made his boldest move yet. Late one evening, James and Linda were startled by a loud knock on the door. When Linda opened it, a man in a suit handed her a thick envelope. It was a legal summons. The HOA was suing them. Linda's face went pale as she held the papers. James took them from her, his hand steady. He looked at the bold letters on the first page. Plaintiff, the Oakwood Homeowners Association versus Defendant, James Miller. James leaned back in his chair, exhaled deeply, and muttered under his breath. "So this is how they want to play it. Fine, let's go to war." The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and coffee, the kind of scent that clung to the walls of buildings where countless battles had already been fought. James wheeled himself through the double doors, his son Mark walking beside him with a folder clutched tight under his arm. Linda followed close behind, her face pale but determined. Across the aisle, Richard sat stiffly in his tailored suit, flanked by the HOA's attorney. He didn't so much as glance in James's direction. His jaw was locked, his expression smug, like a man certain he was about to win. The courtroom filled quickly. Neighbors, curious onlookers, even a few reporters had come to watch. This wasn't just another petty HOA dispute. This was shaping up to be a precedent. When the judge entered, the room went silent. Everyone rose, then sat as the proceedings began. The HOA's lawyer went first. She spoke confidently, laying out a case that the ramp was an unauthorized structure that violated neighborhood aesthetics. She argued that allowing James to keep it would open the floodgates to further violations. James listened, stone-faced, as if the lawyer's words were nothing but background noise. But when she concluded with, "The HOA is simply enforcing the rules agreed upon by all residents," James leaned toward Mark and whispered, "She doesn't even hear herself, does she?" Then it was their turn. Mark stood, adjusting his tie nervously before addressing the court. "Your Honor," he began, "this case isn't about aesthetics. It isn't about neighborhood rules. It's about human rights. My father, James Miller, is a disabled veteran. He built this ramp not as a choice but as a necessity, his only safe access into his own home." The judge nodded slightly, inviting him to continue. Mark laid out the ADA laws, referencing precedents where HOAs had been forced to back down in similar cases. He presented the inspector's report confirming the ramp met all building codes. Finally, he submitted the petition signed by dozens of neighbors, showing overwhelming community support. James could see Richard's confidence faltering with every piece of evidence laid on the judge's desk. But the real turning point came when James himself testified. Wheeling up to the stand, he locked eyes with the judge and spoke in a steady, unwavering voice. "I served this country for 22 years. I came home with injuries that I'll carry for the rest of my life. This ramp isn't an eyesore. It isn't some rebellion against rules. It's my independence. Without it, I'm trapped inside my own home." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Even Richard shifted uncomfortably, his smug facade cracking. James continued, "I respect rules. I've lived by them my entire life, but rules without compassion. Rules that strip people of basic dignity. Those aren't rules worth following. Those are chains, and I won't live in chains again." When he finished, Linda dabbed her eyes with a tissue, and even a few spectators sniffled quietly. The HOA's attorney tried to counter, but the momentum had shifted. It was no longer a case about bylaws. It was a case about morality, fairness, and the law itself. After closing arguments, the judge leaned forward, his voice firm. "I've heard enough. This ramp is a reasonable and necessary accommodation under federal law. The HOA's demands for removal are not only unlawful but unconscionable. The ramp stays." James exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Linda squeezed his hand tightly. Mark grinned, tears welling in his eyes. But the judge wasn't done. He turned to Richard and the HOA's lawyer. "Furthermore, this court finds the HOA engaged in harassment by issuing excessive fines and filing baseless complaints. The association will rescind all fines immediately and is ordered to pay the defendant's legal fees." The room erupted in murmurs. Richard's face turned crimson. He opened his mouth as if to argue, but the judge cut him off with a sharp rap of the gavel. Case dismissed. James wheeled himself out of the courtroom to a round of quiet applause from supporters. Outside, cameras flashed as reporters rushed forward. One shoved a microphone near his face. "Mr. Miller, how do you feel after today's ruling?" James smiled for the first time in weeks, a genuine, unburdened smile. "I feel free, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been bullied by an HOA that forgot what it means to be human." That night, the neighborhood buzzed with talk of the victory. Some residents who had stayed silent finally admitted they admired James's courage. Others were furious at Richard, demanding his resignation. At the next HOA meeting, the pressure was unbearable. Residents packed the room, voices raised. "You embarrassed us." One neighbor snapped at Richard. "You cost us money. You lied to us about the law." Within weeks, Richard was forced to step down as HOA president. For once, the board seemed willing to listen to the community instead of dictating from above. James kept his ramp, and with it his independence. But more than that, he'd changed something in Oakwood. People were no longer afraid to push back. The HOA had been reminded that rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky orange, James sat on his porch, his dog resting at his feet. Linda brought out 2 cups of tea and sat beside him. "You did it," she said softly. James looked out at the quiet street, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We did it," he corrected, "and I'd do it all again." The ramp glowed faintly in the fading light, no longer a symbol of defiance but of victory, dignity, and resilience. And for James Miller, that was worth more than any rulebook ever written.